Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the serious movements we're seeing in oil prices, which are now sending shockwaves through global markets. And the reason this matters is because oil sits right at the heart of the global economy. So when prices move this dramatically, the consequences can ripple through inflation, interest rates, and economic growth around the world. As a direct result, stock markets around the world have now started to tumble as investors become increasingly nervous about the ongoing war in the Middle East, rising energy prices, and the growing risk that the conflict could escalate further with no clear end in sight. And if the situation continues to deteriorate at the pace we're seeing right now, this could have a massive impact on the global economy. Oil prices have surged dramatically, with Brent crude briefly touching $119.5 per barrel, which is the highest level we've seen since the start of the war in Ukraine. The move itself has been extremely significant. Prices jumped sharply in a very short period of time, representing one of the largest moves in oil markets for several years and highlighting just how nervous traders have become about global energy supplies. And obviously the reason for this dramatic move is the ongoing war in Iran, which is having a huge impact on global energy supply chains. The key issue right now is the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. This is one of the most strategically important shipping routes anywhere in the world. Normally, around 1/5 of global oil supply passes through this narrow channel every single day, making it one of the most important arteries in global energy markets. However, since the escalation of the conflict, the strait is effectively closed to Western shipping, with international tanker traffic collapsing and only Iranian-owned and controlled vessels continuing to operate in the area. In practical terms, one of the most important oil routes in the world has effectively been shut down for a large part of global trade, and that immediately creates a major problem for global energy supplies. At the same time, we're also seeing production cuts and export disruptions across several countries in the region. Some producers are cutting output because they simply cannot ship their oil safely, while others have declared force majeure because exports have become impossible under the current conditions. So what we are now seeing is a simultaneous reduction in supply across multiple producers in the Middle East. And when supply suddenly falls in global energy markets, prices can rise extremely quickly. This is actually a very good real-world example of a key concept in economics. All demand is what economics describe as highly inelastic. In simple terms, that means when prices rise sharply, demand does not fall very much in the short term because countries still need oil for transport, aviation, agriculture, manufacturing, and electricity generation. So if supply suddenly drops, but demand remains largely unchanged, prices can spike extremely rapidly. And that is exactly what we're seeing right now. Global supply is falling while demand remains broadly stable, and markets are reacting accordingly. Governments around the world are now beginning to discuss potential emergency measures. The G7 countries are reportedly considering releasing oil from their strategic petroleum reserves in order to stabilize global markets and increase supply in the short term. These reserves exist specifically for emergency situations like this. However, this is only a temporary solution. Strategic reserves cannot be used indefinitely. So while releasing oil from reserves may calm markets in the short term, it does not solve the underlying problem, which is the disruption to global supply. And oil is not the only energy market reacting. We're also seeing natural gas prices rising sharply. And this is particularly important for Europe. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe has shifted away from Russian pipeline gas and increasingly moved towards liquefied natural gas imports. At the same time, many European countries have built large number of gas-fired power stations, which means natural gas prices feed directly into electricity prices. So when gas prices surge, as they are at the moment, electricity costs often follow, which means higher energy bills for households and higher costs for businesses. And ultimately, that feeds through into higher inflation. Before talking about inflation and interest rates, it's also worth briefly putting into this situation into some historical context, because as we've discussed previously, this isn't the first time that geopolitical tensions in the Middle East have triggered major shocks in global oil markets. During the 1973 oil crisis, when Arab producers imposed an embargo during the Yom Kippur War, oil prices quadrupled. And during the 1979 Iranian Revolution, oil prices more than doubled as Iranian production collapsed. And we saw another sharp spike during the 1990 Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait, with prices roughly doubling in a matter of months. And in each of those cases, the economic consequences were very similar: higher inflation, tighter monetary policy, and slower economic growth for the globe. So, the key question now is whether disruption to energy supplies that we're seeing today could start to produce similar economic effects. Financial markets are already reacting to these developments. Stock markets have begun to fall as investors try to assess the potential economic impact of higher energy prices and a prolonged conflict in the Middle East. But we're also seeing movements in bond markets. Government bond prices are falling and yields are rising. And this matters because bond yields determine the cost of borrowing for governments. If yields rise significantly, governments around the world will have to pay higher interest rates on their debt. That is particularly problematic for countries that already have very high levels of debt, including the United States and the United Kingdom and many other European countries. Another development that could prolong the crisis is the political situation inside Iran. Iran has now elevated the son of the supreme leader, who was killed at the start of the war, positioning him as the new leader, and he has a hardline leadership structure similar to his father, which means the chances of a rapid diplomatic solution to this conflict appear to be declining rather than improving. And the longer this war continues, the greater the economic consequences are likely to become. Perhaps the biggest concern right now is the potential impact on inflation and interest rates. Until recently, many central banks were expecting to begin cutting interest rates during 2026, as inflation gradually moved back towards target levels. But a major energy shock, such as we're seeing right now, could change that outlook very quickly. If oil and gas prices remain elevated, inflation will almost certainly rise again. And if inflation rises, central banks may be forced to keep interest rates higher for longer or potentially even increase them again. Higher interest rates slow economic growth by increasing borrowing costs for households and businesses. Mortgage payments rise, corporate borrowing becomes more expensive, investment slows, and economic growth weakens. So what we are now seeing is a situation where a geopolitical crisis is rapidly turning into a global economic shock. We already have oil prices surging, gas prices rising, stock markets falling, bond yields increasing, and growing concerns that inflation could return. And if the disruption to global energy supplies continues, these pressures could intensify further. The global economy has only just begun to stabilize after several years of disruption caused by the pandemic, the Ukraine war, and the global inflation crisis. But the situation unfolding in the Middle East right now threatens to derail that fragile recovery, and the next few weeks could prove absolutely critical. So I'll keep you posted on any further major developments as soon as they occur, but hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. If you'd like to get involved in that, scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Thank you so much to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, really appreciate that long-term support. Thank you. And here's something to put a smile on your face.
Uh,